Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is taking on trans activists again. Many of you might have seen a previous episode where we broke down how Pierre Poilievre is rejecting gender ideology and what this might mean going forward, especially as we're set to have a major election in Canada this year. In late December, Pierre Poilievre gave us a few more examples of what his position on gender ideology actually is. So on December 22, he tweeted out this: "Surreal, a man who killed his wife and 2 kids now claims he is a woman to go to a female prison. I can't believe I have to say this, but when I'm PM, there will be no male prisoners in female jails, period." And then again the next day, on December 23, he tweeted, "For nearly a year and a half as Trudeau's public safety minister, Dominic LeBlanc supported this weirdo policy allowing violent male criminals to move to female prisons where they can prey on women again. No wonder crime has spiraled out of control under LeBlanc." Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, he's drawing attention to a policy of the Trudeau governments that came in under Trudeau, and now it looks like will end under the Conservative Party when they form government, likely later this year. But it's worth taking a look at what's happened as a result of that policy here in Canada, because this policy has gotten almost no traction in the mainstream media, aside from a couple of really great reports in the National Post after the last couple of years. Now, Pierre was responding to a recent horror story out of Quebec. Let me quote that story from the Post, which came out a couple of weeks ago. "Mohamed Al-Balouz brutally killed his wife and 2 sons in 2022, and last week was sentenced to life in prison with no shot at parole for 25 years. Because he now identifies as Levana, Al-Balouz has asked to serve that sentence in a women's prison, the Juliet Institution for Women. If this wish is granted, female inmates there will have to share space with a male counterpart who stabbed his wife 23 times. It would be an absurd and inhumane scenario, and it's only possible because of a 2017 policy change championed by Trudeau that requires prisoners to be sorted according to gender identity and not genitalia." Now, that's not quite right. The reason that male criminals were being put into female prisons is because the law of the land under the Trudeau regime was that a man who identified as a woman was legally considered to be a woman, regardless of whether they'd made any attempt to go through a sex change and regardless of whether or not they were actually a woman. So the acceptance of gender ideology by the government resulted in women being assaulted in Canadian prisons by male prisoners. But the reason for that is because those male prisoners were considered to be female. Justin Trudeau thinks Levana Mohamed Al-Balouz, what's-his-face, is actually a woman. Why? Because what's-his-face said that he is a woman. And that's enough under current Canadian law to get sent to a female prison. Now, interestingly, it's really interesting to see how the Canadian media frames these debates, because the newspapers want to recognize the sheer insanity of this policy, but they don't want to get into a brawl with Canada's very powerful LGBT activists. And so they try to sort of thread the needle by using language that the transgender activists accept while rejecting the agenda that the transgender activists advocate for. And so the Post says this: "Today, a fully intact criminal, rapists included, can be housed in the same facility as vulnerable women, balls and all. The first transfer, gang-related killer Fulton Albee, formerly Jean-Paul, was moved into a women's facility in 2017 in a move that warmed hearts at the CBC, referring to the CBC's championing of this move as a great day for transgender human rights. It only continued from there. Trans-identifying bank robber Sam Steven Mellenbacher was kept in a female prison and, according to another inmate, caused 3 women to require the morning after pill. Mellenbacher went on to receive a sexual assault charge, but it was eventually dismissed. Most vile is perhaps the incarceration of baby rapist Tara D'Souza, Adam Lebuchan, I've written about before, and serial pedophile Madeleine Harks, or Matthew Harks, in a female facility. In 2021, a woman's advocate reported to the House of Commons that both individuals had been antagonizing a fellow inmate and her child in that facility's mother-child program. Now, you'll notice that the National Post very cleverly avoided using pronouns for any of these prisoners, therefore dodging the whole debate about whether or not Madeline, Matthew, and Tara Adam are in fact males. They don't want to get into a debate about whether transgender women actually are women, and so what they do is they just quote the reality of what these prisoners are doing inside female prisons without getting into the argument that's really at the root of the entire policy and at the root of all the changes we've seen happen on the transgender agenda during the Trudeau tenure, which is, are transgender women women or not? And of course, the answer is they are not. They are males. Sex is a binary, and gender identity isn't relevant to your sex, full stop, whether it's relevant at all. And so before 2017, all pre-op trans prisoners being, again, the Post's way of wording this, I prefer the phrase trans-identifying prisoners, they were kept in a prison dedicated to their sex, and only post-op males, that is, males who had a sex change and were castrated, were allowed into female prisons. And a key factor limiting transfers was the fact that pre-op transgender identifying males weren't eligible for surgery unless they'd lived as a woman for several years. But in 2016, as a result of Netflix's trans plotline featuring Orange is the New Black, then Liberal Minister Ralph Goodale signed a more accommodating prison policy. And in January 2017, he unveiled the change. Prisoners would be eligible for cross-sex surgery if they lived as the opposite sex for 1 year in prison or out of prison. And get this, just a couple of days after this policy was announced, Justin Trudeau was confronted at a town hall by a transgender activist. And this activist accused the federal prison system of committing torture and decried the fact that Trudeau had promised to look into the matter and then uttered the magic words, trans rights or human rights.
I'm also a transgender advocate, and I am extremely happy that C-16 looks like it's going to pass and through the Senate very shortly. But what I want to talk about is one of the after effects of C-16, and that is with Corrections Canada. Corrections Canada has, in the past, been doing what I consider torture of transgender inmates by placing, like especially trans women, in a prison for men. Now, you would not, of course, consider the fact that a woman of any other type would be put in a men's prison, but trans women have been. This is especially of a concern when you read that one article out of Australia where a trans woman claims she had been raped over 2,000 times. Now, I'm not saying that happens in Canada. I strongly suspect a lot of trans women are put into segregation, which is not much better than solitary confinement. So my question to you is, will you do your best to ensure that trans women are put in prison, or prison more appropriate to their gender identity?
The answer is yes. I will ensure that. I mean, this is a great example of the value of having these community meetings like this in these town halls, because I'll admit I consider myself to be a fairly strong advocate for LGBTQ2 issues and fairly aware of all the different pressures, and this wasn't one that I had ever thought of. So thank you for bringing it forward, and I will make sure that we look at it and we address it, and we do right in recognizing that trans rights are human rights, that we need to make sure that we are defending everyone's dignity and rights in every way we can, and this is something that if we're not already addressing it, and I hope we're starting to address it even without my leaning in on it, now we will take a closer look at it. Thank you.
And a week later, 1 week after a trans activist confronted Justin Trudeau, federal prisons were ordered to evaluate transgender transfer requests on a case-by-case basis, eliminating this old standard entirely. And so Justin Trudeau personally accelerated exposing female prisoners to violent male offenders, all because of one trans activist at a town hall. That's how policy has been made in Canada now for years. And the Post goes on to point out that the majority of Canadians aren't on board with this. But again, the Post does ignore the real debate, which is when a male decides to identify as a woman, is he now a woman, yes or no? Is there some sort of weird process that goes on when he magically says, I am now a she, I am no longer Matthew, I am Madeline, I am no longer Adam, I am Tara? Does that mean that suddenly they are the thing that they claim to be, yes or no? And the mainstream media, again, some of them are finally pointing out the insanity of these policies, but they're not actually attacking the fundamental worldview supposition at the heart of these strategies. Now that gets me to why I think Pierre Poilievre has been handling this one so well, because as you know, you'll notice in the 2 tweets that I read out, he's simply avoiding the argument altogether, but he's avoiding the argument not by dodging it the way the National Post is doing here, by avoiding the use of certain pronouns, by avoiding the fundamental question. He's avoiding the debate by taking the side of sanity. And what I mean by that is he is not referring to these prisoners as trans-identifying prisoners. He's not referring to them as pre-op transgender women. He's simply saying they are males. Males should not be in women's prisons, full stop. The insanity is not that transgender prisoners are allowed inside prisons when they have not gone through a sex change. The insanity is that men are being put in women's prisons. And this is a carte blanche, complete rejection of the worldview, the ideology that has essentially dominated Canada's government for the last 9 years. Poilievre is ignoring the fundamental premise of both the Trudeau government's policy and of the transgender movement, that these violent male prisoners are women because they claim to be women. And what's clever here too is Poilievre is assuming correctly that the vast majority of Canadians do not actually believe this, and that as such, he can merely assert the facts of the matter and sidestep the transgender tar baby entirely. Trudeau believes that these violent criminals are women. Trans activists do as well. Poilievre clearly does not, and he is clearly asserting this fact, and because he won't play their game by their rules, he can't lose at their game. This strategy isn't immediately obvious because it isn't flashy. It's really common sense, and dare I say, it's very normal. Thanks so much for joining us on The Bridgehead today. If any of you have any stories that we should cover, please drop a comment below. If you have any vigorous disagreement or heckling you'd like to do, please drop those comments as well. You can find our content wherever you download your podcasts. And if you found this content helpful, please do share the video or like it. Thanks so much for listening.